Mark usually came home when the sky had already surrendered to that washed-out violet-gray shade of twilight, the color of a day spent to exhaustion, leaving little energy for anyone inside the two-story suburban house. Julia, his wife, was no different. Still in her fitted office dress, her makeup half faded, her shoulders bent beneath the fatigue of meetings and deadlines. They often crossed each other in the hallway, he setting his leather briefcase on a chair, she already flipping open her laptop to squeeze in one last email before dinner. Ethan, their 15-year-old son, had long grown accustomed to this routine. He barricaded himself in his room, headphones on, light from his monitor painting his face. Online music and friends' voices filled the gaps left by the silence downstairs. Lily, 11, still tried. Each evening, when she heard the door, she would run out, asking her mother if she was tired, offering her father water. But her questions were usually brushed off with a distracted nod or a half-hearted later. There had once been warmth in this house. Back in the early years, when Mark and Julia first married, their apartment had been cramped, half the size of this one. Yet dinners stretched long, filled with laughter. Now dinner was procedural. Reheated meals, Mark scrolling his phone between bites, Julia silently chewing while her mind ticked over pending tasks. Ethan said little. Lily kept glancing at them, waiting for a thread of conversation to catch. "Dad, will you be home early tomorrow?" Lily asked one night, voice hopeful but careful. Mark didn't look up. "I've got an important meeting." Julia cut in, weary. "Eat, honey. Don't bother your dad." Ethan gave a short, bitter laugh and pushed back his chair. "It's always the same." He left for his room, leaving behind a thicker silence than before. Julia exhaled. She knew Ethan was slipping further away, but her brain was crowded with numbers: college tuition, mortgage, retirement savings. She told herself she worked for the children, even as the work built a wall between them. Mark thought the same way. He was the provider, the one who carried the burden. Love had turned into a kind of joint venture, two adults grinding forward, trying to secure a future, while the present crumbled beneath their feet. That Friday, Julia carried home a thick folder of documents. Lily rushed to her with a sketchbook, proudly showing a drawing of the family standing beneath a huge tree. Julia glanced, smiled thinly, and set it aside. "Beautiful, sweetie. Let me look later, okay? I really need to finish something urgent." Lily hugged the sketchbook closer, blinking fast. She nodded and slipped away. Ethan had been watching. "I don't even know why you two work so hard," he said flatly. "You think money fixes everything? Nothing ever changes." Mark snapped his head up. "Don't talk nonsense. Everything we do is for you and your sister. You think money falls out of the sky?" Ethan held his father's gaze, unflinching. "I just want you here. But I guess that's the one thing you can't give." Then he stormed out, leaving Mark and Julia in a silence heavier than argument. That night, Julia lay awake, listening to Ethan's restless pacing above. She remembered when he was small, when he clung to her legs, when he waited by the window for Mark to return home. That boy had turned into a young man who looked at his parents like strangers. She wondered if she had chosen wrong. Had they been foolish to chase security so relentlessly? Or was it the only way to survive in this country, in this century? Beside her, Mark scrolled through his phone, blue light on his face. Julia wanted to ask if he was scared too, if he saw what was happening to their family. Instead, she turned to the wall. Their long conversations had vanished years ago, replaced by fatigue and numbers. The house felt like a solar system, each person still orbiting the same star, but the distances widening, gravity weakening. No one had left, but no one touched anymore. Lily fell asleep hugging her drawing beneath her pillow, convincing herself that tomorrow her mother would look at it properly. Ethan typed sarcastic messages to his friends about family life, jokes that barely disguised the hollow space inside him. Julia buried herself in work to smother her guilt. Mark clung to the thought of next week's contract, as if that paper promise might anchor him. And so the suburban house continued its rhythm, materially secure, emotionally impoverished. A box glowing each night, its lights disguising the fact that something essential inside had already begun to go dark. The weekend was supposed to bring relief, but in the Parker household it only underlined what had already begun to unravel. On Saturday morning Julia tried to sleep in, but the sound of Lily and Ethan arguing in the kitchen pulled her awake. "Stop using my cereal," Lily shouted, her voice high and trembling. "It's just cereal," Ethan said flatly. "Grow up." Julia rushed down, hair tangled, heart already sinking. Mark was gone, out early for a golf game with clients, though he hadn't even liked golf before he began networking. "Enough," Julia said, stepping between them. "Why can't you two just get along for one morning?" Ethan shrugged, pouring the last of the milk into his bowl. "Because nobody else around here pays attention anyway." Lily slammed the cupboard door and ran to her room, shoulders shaking. Julia wanted to scold Ethan, but she saw the dark circles under his eyes, the anger that looked suspiciously like despair. Instead she just sighed, collecting the cereal box as if rearranging objects could tidy up the feelings spilling across the room. Later that day, Ethan asked if he could go out with friends. Julia, still guilty from the morning, said yes, even pressed some bills into his hand. He didn't look at her when he muttered, "Thanks." Lily asked if they could bake cookies together, and Julia promised, "After I finish some work." Hours later, Lily gave up and went to her room. The cracks were multiplying, small, silent fissures running beneath their daily routine. Sunday dinner had once been sacred in Julia's childhood home. Her mother insisted on a roast, her father asked about everyone's week, and arguments were kept at bay by ritual. Julia had tried to recreate that with her own family, but it had been years since all four of them sat together without phones or distractions. That evening she decided to try again. She made chicken, mashed potatoes, and Lily even set the table carefully, folding napkins into triangles. When Mark arrived, he was late, smelling faintly of beer, apologizing about the extra round with the guys. "Sit," Julia urged. "We're eating together tonight." Ethan rolled his eyes, muttering, "Like that'll fix anything." He stabbed at his food but didn't eat. Lily tried to fill the silence. "I got an A on my history test," she announced brightly. "That's wonderful," Julia said quickly, clapping her hands. "Isn't it, Mark?" Mark glanced up, distracted. "Great job, kiddo." He checked his phone, setting it beside his plate. Ethan snapped. "Can't even put it down for one meal, can you?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I'm dealing with business, Ethan. You think I'm scrolling memes? You want me to lose my job?" Ethan pushed back his chair so violently it screeched against the floor. "Maybe I just want a dad." The words landed heavy, like glass shattering. Lily froze, fork suspended. Julia's stomach dropped. Mark flushed, about to speak, but Ethan was already gone, his footsteps pounding up the stairs. Julia whispered, "You could have tried, just this once." Mark rubbed his forehead. "Everything I do is for them. And somehow, it's never enough." Lily excused herself quietly, carrying her plate to the sink. Julia sat there, hands folded, the meal untouched, staring at the roast chicken cooling on the table, an image of effort without reward. It began with silence, not the peaceful, companionable silence that sometimes hovered around a family after dinner, but a taut, airless quiet that filled the Harper house like smoke. Plates clinked, forks scraped, nobody spoke. Even the television in the adjoining room, usually left running as background noise, was turned off. On Tuesday night, David came home later than usual, his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat from the factory floor and his phone still buzzing with messages about overtime shifts. He barely looked up when he entered the kitchen. Karen had set dinner on the table: pasta, a salad, the kind of meal that took 15 minutes to prepare because 15 minutes was all she could spare between her accounting clients and the invoices stacked on her laptop. Ella, now 17, sat rigid at the far end of the table, earbuds draped loosely around her neck, a shield against interaction. Max, 14, hunched over his phone, thumbing through videos with an intensity that looked less like entertainment and more like escape. "Eat," Karen said, sliding into her chair. Nobody answered. David dropped into his seat, reached for the pasta, and said, "Overtime again tomorrow." "That's the 4th day this week." Karen didn't look up. "I have clients backed up until Friday. Don't expect me home before 9. Ella's fork clattered onto her plate. "Of course. Always work." Always someone else, never us. The words landed sharp, more accusation than complaint. Karen's head snapped up. Excuse me? You heard me, Ella said, her voice trembling with both anger and a brittle kind of hurt. You don't even notice what's happening anymore. Max skipped school yesterday. Did you even know that? Karen's eyes darted toward her son. What? Max flushed. It was one class. Who cares? Nobody here does. David set his fork down slowly, as if the weight of it had suddenly doubled. Max, you can't just. Why not? Max cut him off, his voice sharp with the courage that comes from years of being overlooked. You don't notice when I'm there. You don't notice when I'm not. What's the difference? The room fell into stunned silence. Karen pressed her fingers to her temple. Max, this isn't fair. Fair? Ella's laugh was hollow, jagged. Do you even know the last time we did something together as a family? Do you even remember my birthday last year? You bought me a gift card, like some stranger you barely know. You didn't even ask what I wanted. Karen's cheeks burned. I was working, I thought. That's always your excuse, Ella spat. Work, work, work. Do you know what it feels like to come home to a house where your parents are ghosts? To sit here every night and pretend we're a family when all we are is four people eating at the same table? David's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to insist that the endless hours were for them, for their future, for the house and the college funds and the stability he never had growing up. But the words stuck, heavy in his throat. Because in that moment, watching his daughter's face twist with grief disguised as rage, he couldn't deny the truth. Max shoved his chair back so hard it screeched across the floor. Forget it, I'm done. He stormed down the hall, the slam of his bedroom door echoing through the house. Ella's eyes brimmed with tears she refused to shed in front of them. You think we're fine, but we're not. You're losing us, and you don't even see it. She grabbed her plate and stalked upstairs, leaving her parents in the kind of silence that no amount of pasta could fill. For a long while, Karen stared at the half-empty table. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. They're teenagers, she muttered, though even she didn't believe the dismissal. David leaned back in his chair, his face pale with exhaustion that went beyond physical. No, Karen, they're right. The admission hung between them, raw and unsoftened. Karen's eyes flickered with defensiveness, then softened into something closer to fear. We're doing this for them, she whispered. Everything, for them. David shook his head slowly. If we lose them in the process, then what's the point? The breaking point didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It unfolded over days, then weeks, the fabric of the family unraveling thread by thread. Ella began spending nights at friends' houses, offering vague explanations Karen didn't have the energy to chase. Max's grades slipped further, his assignments left incomplete, his teachers' emails unanswered. David started drinking more after work, just a beer at first, then 2, then 3. Karen worked later than ever, her laptop glowing in the darkened kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. They circled each other like planets locked in separate orbits, too drained to collide, too distant to connect. One night, around midnight, David found Ella sitting in the driveway, knees pulled to her chest. The streetlight cast her in a pale glow, her face streaked with tears. Ella, he said gently, crouching beside her. She didn't look at him. I don't know who you are anymore. The words cut deeper than any accusation. I'm your dad, he whispered, though the title felt fragile, almost fraudulent. Dads are supposed to be there, she said. You're not. David's chest constricted, and for the first time in years, he had no defense, no excuse. He simply sat beside her in the cold night air, the silence between them heavier than words. By the time winter came, the family had grown into strangers living under one roof. Meals were quieter, doors stayed closed, conversations, when they happened, were transactional, rides, schedules, reminders. The Harpers had not shattered in one sudden blow. They had cracked slowly, relentlessly, until the pieces no longer fit together. And in that still, aching distance, each of them wondered, though never aloud, whether the damage was already beyond repair. The following week was no better. Ethan started coming home later, smelling faintly of smoke. Julia tried to confront him, but he only said, "Why do you care now?" Lily became quieter, her drawings filling notebooks that no one saw. One afternoon Julia found one of Lily's sketches, 4 figures at a dinner table. 3 of them were on phones, their faces blank rectangles. Only the smallest figure, Lily herself, had eyes, wide, sad, searching. Julia's throat closed as she stared at it. She tucked the drawing away in her desk, unsure whether to show Mark or to keep it as evidence of her own failure. Mark, meanwhile, felt unappreciated at work and at home. He confided to a colleague one night over drinks. "I'm killing myself to give my kids opportunities, and they hate me for it. Julia barely talks to me anymore. Sometimes I wonder if I even matter there." The colleague patted his shoulder, but the hollow space inside Mark only widened. Julia began waking at 3 a.m., lying next to Mark, listening to his steady breathing. She thought about her own father, who had worked long hours but always made space for family dinners, for Sunday walks. Was it possible to do both, succeed and stay present? Or had she simply failed at the balancing act? She wanted to reach across the bed, touch Mark, ask if he felt it too, the sense that their family was unraveling, but she didn't. Instead, she rolled over, staring into the dark. One night, Ethan came home past midnight. Julia was waiting. "Where have you been?" she demanded. "Out." "With who?" "Friends." "Doing what? Why do you care?" His eyes burned with defiance. Julia tried to steady her voice. "Because I'm your mother." Ethan laughed bitterly. "Funny, you've been acting like a landlord more than a mother." Mark came down the stairs, voice booming. "Watch your tone." Ethan squared his shoulders. "Or what? You'll ground me? You're never here anyway." The argument escalated, voices colliding in the darkened living room. Lily stood at the top of the stairs, clutching the railing, silent tears streaking her cheeks. At last Ethan shouted, "I don't need you," and stormed out, the door slamming so hard the frame shook. Julia collapsed onto the couch, head in her hands. Mark stood frozen, fists clenched, chest heaving. Neither noticed Lily retreating quietly to her room, whispering to herself, "Please don't break." The cracks had become undeniable. What began as tiny fractures of distraction had turned into visible fault lines splitting the household. Mark and Julia still told themselves they were doing all this for the kids. But the kids, Ethan with his bitterness, Lily with her silent sketches, were already carrying wounds that money could never heal. The house, once a promise of stability, now felt like a cage echoing with arguments, silence, and slammed doors. And in that cage, each of them wondered privately, had they already lost the family they thought they were protecting? The Parker house had grown tense in a way that was almost physical. Even when no words were spoken, the air seemed to press against them, heavy and saturated with unsaid things. Doors slammed too loudly, footsteps carried too much weight. Silence lingered in the kitchen like smoke after a fire. Julia noticed it most in Lily. Her daughter's chatter, once bubbling and relentless, had quieted to single words. Fine, she'd answer when asked about school. Nothing, when pressed about homework. At night Julia would hear faint scratching sounds. Lily drawing furiously in her room, page after page, as if art were her only outlet left. Ethan was harder to track. He drifted in and out like a ghost, sometimes at dinner, more often not. When he was home, his headphones were welded to his head, his face tilted toward the blue glow of his phone. Julia tried, once, to knock on his door. "Can we talk?" she asked. Ethan barely looked up. "About what?" "You wouldn't understand." Mark, for his part, doubled down on work. He came home later, often bringing takeout with him, as if food could substitute for presence. He convinced himself he was avoiding conflict, that walking into a quiet house after everyone had gone to bed was easier than facing Ethan's contempt, Julia's disappointment, or Lily's mute eyes. But avoidance was its own choice, and it only deepened the gulf. One Wednesday evening, the storm broke. Ethan hadn't come home again, and Julia's anxiety had turned into anger. She sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling through unanswered texts. When Ethan finally stumbled through the door near midnight, his hair damp with rain, Julia was waiting. "Where were you?" she demanded, voice sharp. "With friends," he said flatly. "Which friends? You don't know them. Were you drinking?" Smell my son. God, Ethan, what are you doing to yourself? Ethan's eyes narrowed. What am I doing to myself? What about what you've done to me? Julia froze. Excuse me? You and Dad. You think money is all that matters. You left me years ago, and you don't even see it. Mark, woken by the noise, appeared on the stairs. What's going on? Ethan spun toward him. You're never here. You don't know anything about me. You care more about your stupid job than your own kids. Mark's jaw clenched. Don't talk to me like that. I'm working to give you a future. I don't want your future. Ethan shouted, voice cracking. I just wanted you. The words rang through the house like a slap. Lily crept down the stairs, clutching her sketchbook, eyes wide. Julia whispered, Ethan, but he was already storming upstairs, his door slamming hard enough to rattle the pictures on the wall. Afterward, the three of them sat in the living room. Julia, Mark, and Lily. None of them spoke for a long time. Finally Lily opened her sketchbook. She turned it toward them. It was a drawing of a house. Inside, 4 figures were separated into different rooms, their bodies small and gray. In the center was a table, empty, untouched. Mark swallowed hard. He reached out to touch the page, but Lily pulled it back. That's us, she whispered. Julia's eyes filled. Sweetheart, we love you. Then why don't you act like it? Lily asked simply. Her voice was soft, but it landed heavier than any accusation. Julia covered her mouth, unable to speak. Mark rubbed his temples, feeling suddenly exposed. The children had been watching, cataloging every absence, every missed word, every broken promise. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were mapped, recorded, and illustrated in pencil. The next days passed in uneasy quiet. Ethan barely emerged from his room. Lily stopped showing her drawings. Julia buried herself in work with a kind of desperation, afraid to sit still with the knowledge of her failures. Mark threw himself into meetings, but even there he found himself distracted, his colleagues' voices muffled as Ethan's words replayed in his head. I just wanted you. Friday night, Julia decided she couldn't let it stand. She marched to Ethan's door, knocked once, and entered before he could answer. He was sitting cross-legged on the bed, hoodie pulled up, scrolling through his phone. We need to talk, Julia said. No, we don't. Yes, we do. Ethan, I know we've failed you. The words tasted foreign on her tongue. I thought providing for you was enough. I see now it isn't. I'm sorry. Ethan looked up, startled. His eyes glistened but his jaw stayed tight. Sorry doesn't change anything. No, Julia admitted. But maybe it can start something. For a moment, something shifted in his face. Hope, maybe, but then it hardened again. You'll just go back to work tomorrow. Julia felt tears sting. Maybe I will, but I want to do better. I want you to help me figure out how. Ethan turned away, shoulders tense. He didn't answer, but he didn't tell her to leave either. That weekend, Mark tried. He suggested a family outing, bowling, a movie, anything. Ethan scoffed. Lily shrugged. Julia, exhausted, almost vetoed it. But something in Mark's eyes, pleading, raw, made her agree. They went bowling. It was awkward, forced. Ethan played one round, then retreated to his phone. Lily threw gutter balls and tried not to cry. Julia kept glancing at Mark, silently blaming him for not knowing how to reach their son. Mark blamed himself too, but he hid it behind brittle cheer. On the way home, rain streaked the windshield. Ethan muttered from the backseat, this doesn't fix anything. Mark gripped the wheel tighter. I know, he said quietly. But it's all I can think to do. Julia closed her eyes. They were trying, fumbling, failing in real time. Yet even in failure, there was the faintest suggestion of effort, a crack in the wall that let in a thread of light. That's always your excuse, Ella spat. Work, work, work. Do you know what it feels like to come home to a house where your parents are ghosts? To sit here every night and pretend we're a family when all we are is 4 people eating at the same table? David's jaw tightened. He wanted to defend himself, to insist that the endless hours were for them, for their future, for the house and the college funds and the stability he never had growing up. But the words stuck, heavy in his throat. Because in that moment, watching his daughter's face twist with grief disguised as rage, he couldn't deny the truth. Max shoved his chair back so hard it screeched across the floor. Forget it, I'm done. He stormed down the hall, the slam of his bedroom door echoing through the house. Ella's eyes brimmed with tears she refused to shed in front of them. You think we're fine, but we're not. You're losing us, and you don't even see it. She grabbed her plate and stalked upstairs, leaving her parents in the kind of silence that no amount of pasta could fill. For a long while, Karen stared at the half-empty table. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. They're teenagers, she muttered, though even she didn't believe the dismissal. David leaned back in his chair, his face pale with exhaustion that went beyond physical. No, Karen, they're right. The admission hung between them, raw and unsoftened. Karen's eyes flickered with defensiveness, then softened into something closer to fear. We're doing this for them, she whispered. Everything, for them. David shook his head slowly. If we lose them in the process, then what's the point? The breaking point didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It unfolded over days, then weeks, the fabric of the family unraveling thread by thread. Ella began spending nights at friends' houses, offering vague explanations Karen didn't have the energy to chase. Max's grades slipped further, his assignments left incomplete, his teachers' emails unanswered. David started drinking more after work, just a beer at first, then 2, then 3. Karen worked later than ever, her laptop glowing in the darkened kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. They circled each other like planets locked in separate orbits, too drained to collide, too distant to connect. One night, around midnight, David found Ella sitting in the driveway, knees pulled to her chest. The streetlight cast her in a pale glow, her face streaked with tears. Ella, he said gently, crouching beside her. She didn't look at him. I don't know who you are anymore. The words cut deeper than any accusation. I'm your dad, he whispered, though the title felt fragile, almost fraudulent. Dads are supposed to be there, she said. You're not. David's chest constricted, and for the first time in years, he had no defense, no excuse. He simply sat beside her in the cold night air, the silence between them heavier than words. By the time winter came, the family had grown into strangers living under one roof. Meals were quieter, doors stayed closed, conversations, when they happened, were transactional, rides, schedules, reminders. The Harpers had not shattered in one sudden blow. They had cracked slowly, relentlessly, until the pieces no longer fit together. And in that still, aching distance, each of them wondered, though never aloud, whether the damage was already beyond repair. Winter pressed down heavy on the Harper household, as if the gray skies themselves mirrored the chill inside their walls. Nobody said it aloud, but they all felt the distance. The dinner table, once the nightly battleground, now became a place of quiet avoidance. Ella came and went on her own schedule. Max hid in the glow of his phone. Karen buried herself in spreadsheets. David stayed longer at work, claiming overtime that wasn't even offered. Yet under the routines of silence, there lingered something else. A gnawing awareness that if they didn't change, they would lose each other for good. It began with Karen, one late Sunday afternoon. She was standing at the sink, staring out the window at the bare branches scratching against the glass. She thought of Ella's voice that night in the driveway. Dads are supposed to be there. She thought of Max's bitter defiance. And she thought of herself, hunched over a laptop, measuring worth in billable hours, missing the small, fleeting things that had once defined family. The numbers blurred, the dishes piled in the sink. And for the first time in months, Karen closed her laptop and walked to the living room. David was there, beer in hand, eyes half focused on a game he didn't care about. Karen sat down beside him, her hands folded tight in her lap. We're losing them, she said, her voice quiet but sharp. David turned, startled. Her words carried no accusation, only weary truth. He set the beer down. I know. They sat there, the weight of years pressing down, until Karen whispered, so what do we do? The attempt began awkwardly, as most reconciliations do. That Tuesday, Karen announced she'd be home early to make dinner. It wasn't elaborate, just chicken and vegetables, but she forced herself to chop, to stir, to be present in the small ritual of feeding her family. When Ella walked in, earbuds dangling, She blinked at the sight of her mother at the stove. "What's this?" Ella asked, suspicion edging her tone. "Dinner," Karen said simply. "A real one." Ella hovered in the doorway, uncertain, before finally slipping into a chair. Max followed a few minutes later, drawn more by hunger than curiosity. When David came home, smelling of machine oil and fatigue, he paused at the threshold, sensing something unusual in the air. They ate. At first, silence ruled again. But then Karen said, softly, "Max, how's school?" Max shrugged, fork scratching his plate. "Fine." Ella rolled her eyes. "Liar. He failed his math test." Max glared at her. "Shut up." Karen opened her mouth to scold, but David raised a hand gently. "She's not wrong. But Max, we should have noticed. That's on us, not you." Max froze, caught between defensiveness and the shock of being acknowledged. He stared at his father, and for the first time in months, his voice cracked with something vulnerable. "You never care." David swallowed hard. "I do. I've been too tired to show it. But that's not your fault. I'm sorry." The words landed clumsy, imperfect, but real. And though Max didn't respond, his fork slowed. He ate in silence, but the set of his shoulders softened just slightly. Over the following weeks, the Harpers began to stumble toward one another. It wasn't a miracle transformation. Old habits clung like shadows. Karen still caught herself checking emails at the table. David still drifted toward the fridge more often than he should. Ella still rolled her eyes. Max still retreated behind his phone. But there were cracks in the distance, slivers of connection that hadn't existed before. One Friday evening, Ella came downstairs in a rare moment of candor. "I got invited to the winter dance." Karen's head shot up. "That's great." Ella shrugged. "I don't know if I'm going." "Why not?" She hesitated, then muttered, "I don't have anything to wear." In the past, Karen would have tossed her a credit card, told her to go shopping online. But something held her back. Instead, she closed her laptop and said, "Let's go tomorrow. Just us. We'll find something together." Ella blinked, skeptical. "Really?" Karen smiled, tentative. "Really." The next day, they drove to the mall, awkward at first. But as Ella tried on dresses, Karen remembered the small girl who once twirled in her hand-me-down scarves. They laughed when one outfit fit terribly, shared a smile when another looked perfect. By the end of the afternoon, Ella slipped her arm through her mother's as they carried the shopping bag back to the car. It was a fragile moment, but it was theirs. David, meanwhile, found himself lingering by Max's door one evening, hearing the muffled sounds of video games. On impulse, he knocked and asked, "Mind if I join?" Max looked up, startled, then shrugged. "If you want." The controller felt foreign in David's hands, and his clumsy attempts drew laughter, genuine, unguarded laughter, from his son. "You're terrible," Max said between chuckles. "Yeah," David admitted. "Guess I'll need a teacher." For an hour, they sat side by side, not father and son locked in resentment, but teammates fumbling through digital battles. When the game ended, David looked over and said quietly, "Thanks for letting me play." Max didn't answer, but when David left, the boy's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. The Harpers did not heal overnight. Some dinners still ended in silence. Some days Karen slipped back into work, or David retreated into fatigue. Some nights Ella stayed out too late, and Max slammed his door. But there were also new rituals. Saturday breakfasts, where Karen forced herself to flip pancakes. Sunday walks, where David insisted everyone leave their phones behind. Late-night conversations, halting but earnest, where Ella and Max admitted the hurt that had built over years. The attempt was messy, the attempt was imperfect, but it was real. One evening in early spring, the family sat in the living room, the windows cracked open to let in the first warm breeze of the year. The television was off. Ella curled on the couch with a blanket, Max sprawled on the rug with a book half hidden under his arm. Karen leaned against David, who draped an arm across her shoulder. For once, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't avoidance. It was simply shared. David exhaled, his chest loosening. "Feels different," he murmured. Karen nodded. "Better." Ella glanced up, catching their exchange, and rolled her eyes. but this time, there was no edge in it, only a faint smile. Max shifted closer, the book slipping from his fingers. And for that fragile moment, in the stillness of their modest living room, the Harpers were not ghosts orbiting separate worlds. They were a family, trying, fumbling, stumbling, but together.